On Good Friday, March 24th, 1989, I baked a cake for Dad's 51st birthday. It started out a great day, but turned into one of those "where were you when" moments. When Ronald Reagan was shot, I heard about it over the intercom upstairs in the library at Wasilla High. When the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, I was watching it on TV while standing in my dorm room at UI. On this day, I was in our apartment on Peck Street in Wasilla when the phone rang. "Sarah, turn on the TV." It was Todd's mother, Blanche. The intensity of her voice did not spell good news. I flipped on the TV and was smacked with live footage so surreal it seemed broadcast from another planet. I listened to a somber voiceover explain the images that were coming from Prince William Sound, America's northernmost ice-free port, our busy shipping inlet on Alaska's coast, about 260 miles from Wasilla. Growing up, we had driven many times to the fishing community of Valdez and taken the choppy ferry ride across to Cordova. We'd chug through clean, still gray waters past rocky, tree-sheltered shores that were part of the Chugach National Forest. The waters were full of incredible sea life that's typical and abundant along our coast. Now, though, on the television screen, the Sound appeared as a vast, dark field of heaving sludge. The oil tanker Exxon Valdez had run aground on Bly Reef, and some of its cargo of 53 million gallons of North Slope crude was pouring into the water. Instantly, Alaskans thought of the fisheries. Most everyone in the Valdez-Cordova area relied on the fishing industry for livelihoods and subsistence. They supplemented their purchased groceries with clean, healthy organic salmon, halibut, and other seafood. The industry employs thousands of people, and in fact, fisheries are the state's top private sector employer. More people work seafood jobs than oil and gas, tourism, mining, and forestry combined. The commercial fishermen in the Sound lived much the same lifestyle as our Bristol Bay fishing family. I remember Todd used the word heartbreaking to describe what he saw as he watched the coverage. The land and sea are sacred to Native families who seem instilled with a special connection to God's creation that can only be described as spiritual. How, Todd wondered aloud, how will this ever be cleaned up? It was a good question. Ultimately, the tanker would spill 11 million gallons of oil into the water, which spread across 10,000 square miles of coastal seas. It's an area larger than Connecticut, Delaware, and Rhode Island combined, and contaminated 1,500 square miles of shoreline. Many Americans remember the Exxon Valdez spill as a series of tragic environmental images. Litters of dead seabirds slicked in shrouds of slime, sinister black muck surging against the rocks, workers in fluorescent hazmat suits swabbing the faces of oil-drenched ducks and sea otters. But in addition to being one of the worst man-made environmental disasters in history, the spill was an economic and social disaster. And like the earthquake that had rocked the state on Good Friday exactly 25 years before, the spill would change Alaska forever. Although the spill's epicenter hammered communities along the Sound, the effects rippled through the state like aftershocks. Todd knew immediately that it would have an effect on all wild Alaska fish products, which today make up an $8 billion industry and produce more than 62% of all the United States wild seafood. "There will be a taint on our fish too, Sarah," he told me, referring to the harvest from Bristol Bay, as well as fisheries further north. "Buyers will assume all Alaska salmon is oiled. Watch our price drop this summer." He was right. Fishermen watched helplessly as fish processors posted the price they'd pay for our wild salmon caught that season. It plummeted by 65%, from $2.35 to just 80 cents a pound. After a long cleanup effort, as days rolled into weeks, then months, then years, Alaskans' frustration mounted as ExxonMobil steadily refused to step up and pay the penalty the courts decided it owed for destroying the livelihoods and lifestyles of so many families and communities. And no one in local, state, or national government seemed to be able to hold the corporate giant accountable. ExxonMobil's litigation compounded the suffering, especially for Cordova and Valdez fishermen. Court challenges stretched on for 2 decades. It took 20 years for Alaska to achieve victory. As governor, I directed our Attorney General to file an amicus brief on behalf of plaintiffs in the case, and thanks to Alaska's able attorneys arguing in front of the highest court in the land, In 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the people. Finally, Alaskans could recover some of their losses. When the Exxon Valdez hit Bly Reef, I was a young mother-to-be with a blue-collar husband headed up to the slope. I hadn't yet envisioned running for elected office. But looking back, I can see that tragedy planted a seed in me. If I ever had a chance to serve my fellow citizens, I would do so, and I'd work for the ordinary, hardworking people, like everyone who was part of my ordinary, hardworking world. When I first got into Wasilla city politics, I wasn't even sure how to pronounce the mayor's name. I kept up with state and national politics, but Mayor John Stein was relatively new to the community and was elected while I was away at college. Then I came home, got married, got busy raising babies and living life. It was Nick Carney, the self-proclaimed local mover and shaker and president of the Wasilla Chamber of Commerce, who set me on the path of public service. Wasilla was his town. His wife led the local library board. The two of them were big golfers and liked to wear visors and golf shorts around a town where a lot of folks wore Carhartts and bunny boots, the fat rubber army boots that are incomparable for keeping your feet warm and dry, and the more duct tape they are, the more Alaskan you are. Nick was running for seat F on the 6-member Wasilla City Council, and in 1992, he recruited me to run for seat E. He told me about a group that called itself WOW, Watch on Wasilla, that was looking for young, progressive candidates. The city would do well to have you serve, he said. In those days, the word progressive wasn't necessarily associated with liberalism, although that's what they meant by it. I took it in the more common-sense spirit of progressing our young city by providing the tools for the private sector to grow and prosper. The group, which was backed by the local newspaper, The Frontiersman, also supported Carney and Mayor Stein. I fit the demographic they were looking for. As a newspaper editor put it, a young, sharp Wasilla resident who lived inside the city limits. Finding a young, sharp person in Wasilla proper wasn't difficult. Finding someone willing to brave the swamp of local politics was. I talked it over with Todd. On the one hand, I was a typical busy mom, not too familiar with the low-level intrigue of a small-town city hall. On the other hand, Wasilla was starting to grow beyond its prior claim to fame as the home of the Iditarod, and the city's leadership was on the verge of making decisions that would affect my family and my community for a very long time. Todd thought it was a great idea. He knew that I wanted to make a difference, and he encouraged my instinct that it was time to get involved. My first campaign was exciting and exactly what you would expect for a small town. I focused on reducing property taxes and redefining government's appropriate role. Without knowing that I was setting a pattern for years to come, I ran an ultra-grassroots campaign with hand-lettered signs that read, "Positively Palin." Track and Bristol were still tiny, so I went door to door asking for people's votes, pulling the kids through the snow on a sled. At that time, believe it or not, Wasilla didn't even have a police force. The Alaska State Troopers had patrolled the area, but said that Wasilla had better grow up because we were big enough to support our own police department. Of course, we'd have to pay for it. There were two options on the table: increase property taxes or adopt a sales tax. I didn't like either, but raising property taxes meant more government control over what residents owned. A sales tax would be fairer and more optional, with a broader base of support in a town like Wasilla, which is a hub for commerce and tourism. So in the campaign, I supported the 2% sales tax, only if it correspondingly reduced property taxes. That got me off on the wrong foot with some local Republicans who heard the word tax and assumed I actually wanted one. When the polls closed, the sales tax had passed. Nick won seat F and I won seat E, defeating a guy who was married to Mayor Stein's secretary. After the election, I went to meet the mayor. We both assumed we would be allies since he and the Carney crew had recruited me to run. We were both wrong. The city council chambers had once been next to my second-grade classroom before the old school was converted to City Hall. It also doubled as a polling station, and when I later became mayor, my office was directly above. The council met twice a month on Monday nights, and among its members, I stuck out like a brownie at a Cub Scout meeting. Most of the guys were around my grandfather's age. In some ways, they had kind of a paternalistic way of governing. For example, They wanted to regulate how many kids a mom could babysit in her home, whether signs on businesses should be allowed to flash, and whether the town barber pole should be permitted to spin, should one ever be installed. But Valley residents, like other Alaskans, are not master plan community kind of people. We are extremely independent. No community organizers necessary. Not a lot of zoning regulations needed either. We are do-it-yourselfers. As proof, after our local Walmart broke the world record for duct tape sales, Wasilla was named the honorary duct tape capital of the world. I agreed with that spirit of independence, and I voted in ways that honored people's ability to think for themselves. Sometimes council members' plans went beyond paternalism to conflicts of interest. For example, Nick tried to spearhead a development plan that would require people living in homes built in new subdivisions to pay for weekly trash removal instead of hauling their trash to the dump themselves, as most Valley residents did, and I still do. It was a convenient proposal. Nick owned the town's garbage truck company. I opposed that too. Now, Nick was the de facto leader of the council, and even though he said Wasilla would do well to have me serve, he became extremely annoyed when I didn't vote the way he did. That didn't bother me. I had to live with my own conscience, so I voted according to my principles and let the chips fall where they may. A vote on garbage seems like small potatoes, but it was not a little thing to me. I wanted our local government to position itself on the side of the people and preserve their freedom so that Wasilla could progress and not restrict opportunities. Almost immediately, my fiscal conservatism kicked in. For one thing, Mayor Stein, Nick, and others on the council wanted to raise the mayor's pay. I thought he made enough money and that there were people whose roads needed fixing before the mayor's paycheck did. I voted no, but the pay raise happened anyway. Because Todd was on the slope a lot, the Carter family usually babysat Track in Bristol during the Monday night meetings. Later in my first council term, the kids started school and I got involved in the PTA. Then our third child, pretty little Willow Bianca Faye, came along. I went into labor with her on the 4th of July while kayaking with the Menards on Memory Lake. I so wanted a patriotic baby that I paddled as hard as I could to speed up the contractions, but she held out until the next day. After she was born, I took Willow to council meetings with me, toting her in her car seat and tucking her next to my legs under the old wooden council table. I didn't care too much what the good old boys said about it either. I served 3 years on the city council, campaigned again, and was elected to 3 more. Then John Stein came up for re-election. A key question arose that convinced me that the town needed new leadership, and it went right back to my concerns about heavy-handed government. The issue was forced annexation. Stein and some council members were fine with forcing other areas of the Mat-Su borough to become part of the city of Wasilla. With a bigger footprint, the city would increase the size of its tax base, plus gain political power in Juneau. But they tried to sell it with rhetoric like, "Government's here to help. Trust us. You need better public services." For me, it went back to people being able to think for themselves. If they wanted Wasilla's services and Wasilla's property taxes, then they'd choose to be part of Wasilla. I supported annexation by invitation instead. It was evident during my years on the council that the mayor and I had sharply differing ideas about the future of Wasilla and how to make that future happen. I decided to challenge him in the upcoming election in order to effect greater change than I could as a council member. The city's chief executive position provided much more responsibility and more opportunities to see where change could be effected. Besides, as every Iditarod musher knows, if you're not the lead dog, the view never changes. I ran another very grassroots campaign, mostly with the help of my girlfriends. We painted pink and green signs with my familiar slogan, "Positively Palin," and posted them all over town. Pink and green because no one else ever used pink and green. And when it was time to knock on every door in the city again, I pulled Track in Bristol in a little red wagon, and this time toted Willow in a toddler backpack. I promised new energy and an end to politics as usual. I raised some eyebrows by promising to cut property taxes. I also promised to take a pay cut. It would be a money-where-your-mouth-is move. If I was going to run as a budget cutter, I figured the cutting had to start with me. Plus, as a council member, I had just voted against a mayoral pay raise. and it would be hypocritical to conveniently forget that vote if I were elected mayor. When the votes were tallied in October, our victory was seen as a huge upset of the political apple cart. I won by a handy margin, so I knew the voters were mandating no more politics as usual. Every Friday morning, I drove down to the local cafe called the Country Kitchen to have breakfast with the regulars. It was a kind of small-town joint where waitresses who could have been named Flo and Ruby poured your coffee into thick off-white ceramic cups and asked after your kids. My kids still remember going there with me for an occasional treat before school. They'd have pancakes and I'd drink coffee, sitting with all these lovable old dudes who owned the plumbing store and the construction company and the septic pumpers, and younger blue-collar workers who were actually building the town. I would just listen to what they had to say about how the town's business was being handled. They loved to gripe about this and that and tell me how to do my job. I loved listening to their ideas and showing them that I cared. I usually agreed with their take on the world. I learned a lot from them, mostly that I wasn't off base in my thinking about what the people expected from their government. They just wanted it on their side. I finally slowed down that Friday morning routine when I was pregnant with Piper. Nearly every pregnant woman has something that can make her instantly ill, and the cigarette smoke inside the cafe kind of nauseated me. Instead of supporting a much-talked-about citywide smoking ban at the time, though, I just stopped going to that restaurant. It eventually went smoke-free on its own, which is the way things like that should work. My friends and I still did a lot of things together, including clay shooting, and I continued to visit the range while I was pregnant. So in a nod to our Second Amendment, my friends Kristen Cole and Judy Patrick threw me a baby shower at the Grouse Ridge shooting range, complete with a cake in the shape of a Piper airplane. Piper Indy Grace was born March 19th, a Monday. Todd flies a Piper plane, but I just like the name. Indy for independence, though the Indy 500 is pretty cool too. And Grace for God's grace. The next day, I took her by work when I checked in on City Hall. She was a fun and accommodating kid from the start, even arriving exactly on her due date. I hadn't been mayor long when a certain Wasilla resident established herself as the town critic. She showed up for nearly every council meeting on Mondays and a lot of planning commission meetings on Tuesdays. A Birkenstock and granola Berkeley grad who wore her gray hair long and flowing and with a flower behind one ear. She always had something to say, usually about her clogged culvert. She demanded to come to cabinet meetings to make sure my door was literally open, to which the cabinet answered, in unison with me, not just no, but hell no. This town crier would later become an expert on all things Palin when I ran for vice president. At times, I felt like the mayor of Peyton Place. In spite of that, I loved my job and I loved my town. I've always been so proud of the valley. I couldn't wait to push forward with more of my campaign promises. I cut taxes, lots of them. I eliminated small business inventory taxes. I got rid of personal property taxes. I gave the boot to burdensome things like business license renewal fees. And I cut the real property tax mill levy every year I was in office. I worked to pass these cuts with a new group of conscientious, conservative council members who worked with me to develop the city's infrastructure. We had our share of debates, but all of us ultimately shared the same vision for Wasilla. In the mid-1990s, many of the city's main roads were still made of dirt. Even the runway at the municipal airport was gravel. I knew businesses, and thus jobs, wouldn't locate in Wasilla if the tools weren't there for the private sector to grow and thrive. So in an effort to attract businesses, we built and paved roads and extended water and sewer lines. Within a few years, established mom and pops were growing, new ones sprang up, and stores like Fred Meyer, a Walmart superstore, and other national chains opened their doors in our city. In 2002, we put a city bond measure before the voters that would fund construction of a multi-use sports center. Voters approved it, and the half-cent sales tax to pay for it, and we broke ground on this project, which for decades had only been a dream for Valley residents. The arena was named after our good friend, Curtis Menard Jr. The year before, Curtis Jr. was piloting family members back and forth between a Cook Inlet sport fishing site when a small plane went down, and our dear friend was killed at age 36. The community felt honored to name the arena after such an enthusiastic and generous soul. As a result of our common-sense conservative efforts, Wasilla became a booming, bustling town, the fastest-growing area in the state, and an independent financial auditor, Mukunda Cottrell and Company, reported that Wasilla was the envy of other Alaskan cities. Unfortunately, things hadn't gone as well on the police chief front. I thought maybe he'd come around and work with me on the budget. But the issues multiplied, and he forced my hand, so I fired him. This gets at my approach to management. I have a bulletin board filled with coffee-stained, dog-eared quotes tacked up along with family photos that has followed me from office to office since 1992. One of my favorite quotes comes from the author and former football coach, Lou Holtz, on how to build your team. Motivation is simple. You eliminate those who are not motivated. By the time I was 38, my second term was winding down, and I was about to be term limited out of office. Meanwhile, several people approached me saying they hoped I'd stay in public service. Not politicos, just ordinary people. As president of the Conference of Mayors, I saw so many needs around the state, places where I felt I could help, but I had no interest in running for the state legislature. I did not think I would do well in a place where you had to scratch disagreeable backs in order to secure a nameplate in the caucus. About that time, candidates started lining up for the lieutenant governor's race, the bottom half of the ticket led by the popular and powerful U.S. Senator Frank Murkowski, who was coming home to run for governor. The lieutenant governor spot seemed as if it might be a good next step for me, an administrative position where I could put my executive experience to good use in a leadership role. I didn't have a campaign organization, and I certainly didn't have any extra time, but I decided to give it a shot. As it turned out, I came in a close second, coming up short by only about 2% of the vote, despite being outspent 5-1. I had managed not to ingratiate myself with anyone just to fill my campaign coffers, though, so that was some consolation. Deep-pocketed lobbyists don't always write fat checks out of the goodness of their hearts. It was encouraging to know I would not be beholden to special interests going forward, if there was a political forward. A couple of months into his administration, Governor Murkowski offered me a job as chairman of the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, or AOGCC. Established during the days when Alaska was a territory, the commission is a quasi-judicial regulatory body that has a range of duties, many of which affect people, companies, and markets in the lower 48 and around the world. As the entertainment industry is to Los Angeles, corn is to Kansas, and markets are to New York, so is the energy industry to Alaska. More than 85% of the state's budget is built on petroleum-based energy revenues. For more than 30 years, the big oil companies like British Petroleum, BP, Exxon Mobil, and ConocoPhillips have extracted the oil underneath Alaska lands and sold billions of barrels of it to very hungry markets. But oil is not a renewable resource. Once it's gone, so it has to be dealt with prudently. Many Alaskans were aware that these huge multinational energy corporations had been leasing oil-rich chunks of land on the North Slope, but were just sitting on the leases, in some cases for decades. And as long as they held the leases, other companies couldn't come in and compete for the right to tap our resources, so parts of the oil basin were essentially locked up. When Murkowski appointed me Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission chairman, one of the first things I told him was that we needed to make sure our resources were not being wasted and hold the oil industry accountable to its contracts. AOGCC functions include maximizing oil and gas recovery, minimizing waste, approving oil pool development rules, and maintaining state production records. The Commission also lends a hand in protecting the environment from contamination during drilling and also ensures environmental compliance in production, metering, and well abandonment activities. So federal agencies like the EPA, as well as private interests and environmental groups, have key interests in the Commission's activities. In my view, the nation deserved an agency that was a fair, impartial body with the best interests of Alaskans and the country in mind. I hadn't been there long when it became clear that that wasn't necessarily the case. nor did I have any idea how my involvement would lead me into a head-on confrontation with the forces of corruption in the highest levels of the state and my own party. The AOGCC is led by 3 commissioners appointed by the governor, each one representing expertise in petroleum engineering and geology, plus a representative from the public sector, the posts I filled. A geologist, Dan Seamount, an experienced, non-political, outdoorsy type who was friendly and especially knowledgeable in coal bed methane development, was already serving on the commission. Randy Riedrich, a former general manager of Doyon Drilling and a contractor for the oil company Arco, was named to the petroleum engineering position. It was Murkowski's 3rd eyebrow-raising appointment in a short tenure, but this one was especially troublesome because Riedrich was the state Republican Party chairman and would remain so during his tenure. He was also a member of the Republican National Committee. Riedrich was the key fundraiser for the GOP and naturally solicited party dollars from the oil and gas industry players we were to be regulating, something that should have immediately been pegged as a conflict of interest. Of course, being married to Todd, I was also accused of literally being in bed with the oil industry. I had to explain that as a blue-collar union hand, a production operator wearing a hard hat and steel-toed boots, Todd wasn't calling the shots for the corporate bosses in London. In fact, I told Alaskans, Todd's not in management, he actually works. The state determined that there was no conflict of interest with Todd's slope job. Riedrich, though, had held his former position as Doyon's general manager during the period when the company pled guilty to federal felony charges for environmental crimes on the North Slope. In July 1995, Riedrich testified before the U.S. Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, chaired by then-Senator Frank Murkowski, that a new method of disposing drilling waste back down wells had boosted environmental safety because it eliminated unsightly waste pits. But just a month later, a whistleblower reported that Doyon was actually injecting illegal and hazardous substances down wells in order to save money. The FBI and EPA investigated Doyon and BP. BP paid a $500,000 fine, and Doyon paid a $1 million fine. When Riedrich became an AOGCC commissioner, there were whispers on the staff and among the public about the fox guarding the henhouse. And the trouble began almost immediately. When Murkowski tapped me for the commission, he quickly named me chairman. That meant I also became the ethics supervisor of the staff, a job that turned out to be more than just a compliance title. When a staffer hinted right away that Riedrich seemed to spend a lot of time running the Republican Party from his new AOGCC office, plus dealing with GOP operatives as a national Republican committeeman, I mentioned it to the party boss/commissioner. Then another problem cropped up. Riedrich involved himself in adjudicating 2 cases that were closely intertwined with his old Doyon illegal dumping case. Commissioner Seamount and I urged Riedrich to recuse himself, but he refused. An administrative assistant took me aside to say she suspected Riedrich of sharing confidential commission information with a coal bed methane company we were supposed to be regulating. She was right. He was passing agency information to the company's lobbyist. I was dealing with the issue while observing my own chain of command. I spoke personally to Riedrich numerous times. Dan Seamount also raised concerns. But no one, including my own ethics supervisor, seemed to take the concerns seriously. He was a young guy who was a political appointee of Murkowski's and a good friend of Randy's. In fact, Randy mentioned often that he was like a grandfather to the ethics supervisor's child. Since the chain of command seemed to be ignoring the conflict of interest and the concerns of commissioners, lawmakers, and citizens, I went to Governor Murkowski's chief of staff. I laid out what I knew so far, including potential conflicts of interest that staff was observing. He assured me that he'd take care of it. "That's what a chief of staff is for," he said. A few days later, I stopped Riedrich in the hall at work. "I think Murkowski's chief is going to be calling you, Randy," I said. "Oh yeah, he called me." I thought, whoa, he must be shaking in his boots. "He calls me every Sunday afternoon," Randy went on. "Really?" I said. "Yeah, we talk politics, what's going on in the administration, that kind of thing." That's when I knew the chief had done nothing. My ethics supervisor was doing nothing. The AG was dismissive of the concerns I repeatedly shared with him, and the public was rightfully questioning the commission's integrity. I wrote a letter to Governor Murkowski. Basically, I told him that his appointee, the chairman of his party, was perceived as trashing the reputation of a state agency. Shouldn't he do something about it? As I typed out the words, I thought, this is it. I'm taking on the party and putting it in writing. My career is over. Well, if I die, I die. Then the strained peas hit the fan. The staff was becoming more vocal. Democrat lawmakers broke their silence, as did others, and I couldn't blame them. Then reporters started calling. One weekend evening, my home phone rang. I picked it up in my bedroom. "Sounds like Randy Riedrich is through," a local television reporter said. "What do you know about it?" I sat down. I don't know anything about it. What do you know? "Sounds like the governor gave him a choice, resign or get fired, and we hear he's gone." He was gone, but I hadn't been told about it, and the problems would still brew. I took fire from both sides. GOP operatives accused me of speaking ill of a fellow Republican and jumping on board with the Democrats, warning that I was through politically. Democrats accused me of covering up for the GOP, and no one in the administration would tell me the status of any investigation into the mess. Meanwhile, I was living under a Department of Law gag rule and paying a high price for my silence. Finally, I wrote Governor Murkowski another letter. I reminded him that I had warned him and the rest of the chain of command about all of this for months, and I had detailed my communications with all of them. I concluded the letter with the suggestion that for the good of AOGCC, to salvage its reputation and to prove a commitment to transparent government, as chairman, I should be allowed to speak publicly about all this. Nothing happened. I knew what I had to do, so I resigned, stepping away from the ethical lapses and hierarchical blinders to effect change where I could, on the outside. After I left, a state assistant attorney general issued a 16-page ethics complaint against Randy, who eventually agreed to pay the highest civil fine in Alaska history. He retained his GOP chairmanship. I stayed busy with the girls and traveled with Track's hockey team as the team manager. The boys were a handful of mischievous fun, and they made my work rewarding. My years in politics were a fine training ground for dealing with small-town dramas involving coaches and referees. Any soccer mom or dad knows what I'm talking about. Winter 2004 came, and with it the unique blanket of darkness that covers our coldest months. For me, it was a time of restlessness, the kind when you know in your soul you're supposed to be preparing for something, that there's something else out there, but the next open door is not yet revealed. I remember waking up in the middle of the night knowing there was something else, knowing there was room for more. When Piper was born, Todd's mother Blanche had given me one of those wonderful glider rockers covered in soft suede. I remember waking up to fresh, fat snowflakes falling outside my bedroom window, the sky as black as India ink. I would pick Piper up from her bed, snuggle her in a worn flannel quilt, and rock with her in the stillness of the night. The gas fireplace would kick on when the temperature dropped to just the right degree, and I could feel the flickers of light and heat near my feet. There was a longing inside me that winter, a sense of purpose hovering just beyond my vision. Was it ambition? I didn't think so. Ambition drives. Purpose beckons. Purpose calls. I definitely wasn't driven toward any particular goal, like power or fame or wealth. So what was it? I wondered, as Piper's sweet breath against my neck matched the rocker's rhythmic glide. I prayed again that if I was to resign myself to what felt like a public service career cut short, that I'd embrace being home full-time. I asked that the fire in my belly and whatever was feeding it would simmer down. I thought of a passage from the book of Jeremiah 29:11-13. "For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans for peace and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. When you call upon me, I will hear you. When you search for me, you will find me, if you seek me with all your heart." It irked me that too often women are made to feel guilty for seeking the next open door, no matter what career choices we make. That seems universal. But one doesn't just create passion, nor consciously generate the feeling that there's a door standing open somewhere, even if you can't see it yet. And it wasn't anyone who pressured me, "Sarah, you've got to get out there and fly, go do more." But I knew there was something more. I thought of the graduation speeches I'd been honored to give over the years as mayor and began to apply their message to myself. I often told the kids to ask themselves, what gets you excited to wake up in the morning? Is it science, art, children, animals, books, sports, mechanics? What is the desire of your heart? I'd add, God put those in you not to tease or frustrate you. He created them in you to give you direction, to put you on the right path. He bridles your passion. So stop and think about what you love to do. Then look for signposts along the way that confirm you're on the right path to doing that. Doors opening, people with your best interests at heart supporting what you're doing. I wasn't sure what I was to do next, yet, but I also knew I was blessed with a supportive family and a husband who took joy in my working hard, so I knew I had options. As I rocked my daughter all those dark nights, I knew that what still stirred passion in me was the desire to make a positive difference for others, not just in my family and community, but in the wider world as well. I resolved to seek confirming signs along the way, the open doors, to show me the right road. I stuck my head out of the window of my black Jetta and shifted into fifth after cresting Thompson Pass. It was winter 2005. The girls were finally asleep, and I needed another gulp of 10 below zero air to keep me from joining them. I fumbled with the CD changer, loaded the kids' Toby Keith, and cranked up How Do You Like Me Now? It was the middle of the night, and I had just emptied my last sugar-free Red Bull. I was already second-guessing my decision to drive the 12-hour round trip to the Valdez meet and greet campaign event in the middle of winter, a distance like going from Raleigh, North Carolina to New York City. Thompson Pass is treacherous in the winter, with an average snow dump of 50 feet, and I kicked myself for not driving Todd's big Dodge truck, even though it was cheaper to drive my little diesel car. I read once that the winter of 52 and 53 had dumped 81 feet of snow in the area. I pictured that while I sought familiar landmarks ahead in the dark distance. There wasn't a doubt in my mind that I was on the right road now, but it was a tough road to barrel down in the dark. I'd finally decided to toss my hat in the ring to replace Frank Murkowski as governor, and I was having a ball working long, intense days. Road trips became our campaign MO since we didn't have the funds to fly, especially when I wanted to take the kids to a campaign event. One-day round-trippers like this weren't ideal, but they were necessary and usually a lot of fun as I worked to cover the state during the year-long gubernatorial campaign. Now with the dark ribbon of highway unfurling in the headlights, my thoughts drifted back to a question my friend Rick Halford had asked me that summer. Do you remember the story of David and the 5 stones? A former state senate president, Rick was the quintessential Alaskan, an outdoorsman and private pilot who flew between his home in Chugiak and the fishing village of Alignagik. Quiet and deeply thoughtful, he was a veteran public servant who I felt had served for the right reasons and had been smart enough to get out while the getting was good, about a term before corruption grew deep roots in Alaska State House. We first met back in 1992 at a Wasilla community forum, where he heard me speak about my vision of a fiscally conservative government as I was campaigning for city council. Rick had recently married one of Todd's childhood friends from Dillingham. Over the summer of 2005, he had called a few times to share his concerns about the direction of the state. You have the 5 stones, Rick said in one of those calls. You have the right positions on ethics, on energy, on government's appropriate role. It's an out-of-the-box idea, and you won't get the establishment's support, but I think you should run for governor. Our state is ready for change. Rick wasn't an establishment Republican in the derogatory sense of the term, but he was definitely influential in the mainstream party, and he was the only person like that, a quasi-insider, who reached out and encouraged me to run. I considered Rick's encouragement to run for governor as one of those signposts on the right road. Some of his colleagues would think it was a horrible idea, he acknowledged. That intrigued me, of course. As Murkowski had, Rick warned how tough the job would be on my family. He knew what he was talking about. As a young senator, he'd had 3 daughters with his first wife, then divorced, remarried, and had 3 sons. In spite of the challenges, he said, I should seriously consider running. You're different. Alaska needs something different. I respected Rick and took what he said to heart. A lot of sincere, hardworking people called to give me their 2 cents worth that summer. They were basically saying the same thing. The growth of government bureaucracy was out of control. The oil companies were sitting on their leases instead of drilling, thus withholding jobs and development opportunities from Alaskans. And people were sick of politics as usual. After the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission issue erupted and rumors began to swirl about FBI corruption probes in Juneau, it was pretty certain that some state officials were on the take. By the end of that summer, the bottom line for me was clear. Voters wanted change, and they should have a straightforward choice about what kind of change it would be. As always, Todd supported me and encouraged me to do it. So on Alaska Day, October 18, 2005, I kicked off the Gubernatorial campaign with about 50 friends, family, and reporters in my living room. It was Bristol's 15th birthday, so of course we had cake. Now here I was, headed home from Valdez, still toting kids on campaign trails, except this time with longer distances to cover, using a Jetta instead of a sled. Ironically, and typically, the trip cost me more than I managed to raise. The Valdez event had been a typical grassroots affair. The local mayor, Bert Cottle, an old friend, had invited me to meet a few folks for cookies and coffee in a small venue. I talked about the potential Alaska had if we protected our Constitution and unshackled the private sector. Most people recognized that Wasilla had thrived while I served there, so I had to touch only briefly on what we'd done. Basically, we'd gotten government out of the way. Throughout the campaign, I made a point of praising the good work ethic and personal responsibility of our pioneers. Then I would tie the state's history to the significance of the election. Always thinking of their kids and mine, I'd tell the voters, there's a lot riding on this election, including the trust of future generations. We need new energy and someone with a stiff spine to fight for you. I'll put government back on your side. I promised that if they hired me as their governor, there would be no more politics as usual, and I had a record to prove it. I won't let you down, I said. In 2005, I was the first Republican to file for governor because I didn't want to play the political wait your turn in line game to see if Murkowski, the incumbent, would seek re-election. I knew I wouldn't have the backing of the party machine anyway, so my reliance on a grassroots effort required an early edge before the other guys started lining up. Clark Perry, a high-energy, red-headed high school friend who worked for the state's Department of Corrections, came to the house the day I kicked off my campaign. His wife, Chris, had been president of the Wasilla Chamber of Commerce when I was mayor, and Clark told me he liked my common-sense politics. I liked him because he was one of the funniest and nicest guys I know, and because he was smart enough to marry Chris, who is one of the sharpest women in America. Clark helped get everything off the ground. He would drive 120 miles round trip every day from his work site at the Palmer Correctional Center in Sutton to our campaign office on Fifth Avenue in Anchorage, prime real estate most commuters had to drive by every day. My friends and I spent our Thanksgiving vacation painting the interior warrior red and painting the Alaska flag on the main wall. Besides coordinating the early work, Clark was in charge of cool things like handing out warm red Palin for Governor headbands at high school football games and community road races, as well as red wristbands that could be seen all over the state. In the primary, I was running against Governor Murkowski, of course, and his friend Randy Riedrich was still the state GOP chairman. A bad omen to some, but to us, a motivating challenge. To win the primary, I'd have to go through both of them. It also meant we'd have no backing from the state party. I found my underdog status and the outsider label quite liberating. If there were only a few politicians bold enough to hook up with us, that was fine too. We built a network of non-political, hard-working Alaskans who were tired of politicians bending with the wind. Our friends volunteered, adamantly believing it was time to put state government back on the side of the people. As the campaign expanded, Chris Perry did what a lot of strong women do. She kindly asked her husband to step aside on this particular venture, and she took over the leadership role. Never having been involved in a campaign before, she succeeded because she has good instincts, works tirelessly, and was there for the right reasons. Chris had grown up in Wasilla, but was much younger than I. We had babies at the same time who'd grown up in school and sports together. Her active community volunteerism proved her servant's heart. At 22, she had become the general manager of the local cellular service provider. Chris had about as much patience as I did for political nonsense. Both of us held high-pressure jobs, and we were wired to handle that pressure through faith in Providence and our knowledge that, at the end of the day, we could only do our very best. As long as our kids were healthy and happy, everything else could melt away and we'd march on just fine. Those similarities, and the fact that Chris is a kick-butt, tell-it-like-it-is soccer mom, helped us forge a deep bond during the campaign, and she became my closest confidant. Our campaign would focus on cleaning house in government and facilitating the private sector development of energy resources, specifically ramping up production of America's energy supplies and building a 3,000-mile, $40 billion natural gas pipeline that other administrations had been promising to build for decades. It could ultimately go from the North Slope to hungry Midwest markets out of a Chicago hub. No more time wasted recycling the same old arguments and excuses as to why it couldn't be done. I was determined that Alaska was going to start contributing more to the nation. We promised to shine a bright spotlight on ethics reform and to clean up the favor factory known as the Capitol building. An undercover FBI investigation of the Alaska State Legislature was bubbling to the surface. In the week after the primary election, federal agents served more than 20 search warrants, many of them at the offices of state legislators, 5 Republicans and 1 Democrat. It turned out that the feds had been investigating links between some lawmakers and Vico Corporation, the oil-field services giant. The warrants authorized agents to search computer files, personal communications, and official reports, as well as any items emblazoned with the phrase Corrupt Bastards Club, or CBC. The CBC had started as a barroom joke after a newspaper opinion piece highlighted 11 lawmakers who had received large campaign contributions from Vico and who appeared to cast votes according to the corporation's demands. The name stuck, and some of the lawmakers thought it was so funny they had hats printed up that said CBC. It wasn't so funny after the Fed showed up. Every part of our campaign shouted change, a change in campaign financing. We ran on small donations from all over the state, mostly from first-time political donors, and we turned back some large checks from donors if we perceived conflicts of interest. A change from photo op stops to honest conversations with actual voters. A change from emphasizing politics to emphasizing people. A change from smooth talk to straight talk, even then. We were amused a couple of years later when Barack Obama, one of whose senior advisors, come to think of it, had roots in Alaska, adopted the same theme. Chris and I joked about it. Hey, we were change when change wasn't cool. On Election Day, we shocked everyone. We won the primary, pulling 51% of the vote in a 5-way race. We won by taking on the entrenched interests and the political machine. With no negativity and with a highly energized grassroots campaign, we moved on to the general election, where we continued to have a ball. I put in 20-hour days with Todd and the kids by my side. Campaign staff kept it real by bringing their kids, along with ours, on the trail as much as possible. We'd stop to take pictures of them standing by frozen waterfalls along the highway or with a double rainbow over the tundra in the background. We all memorized every Big and Rich, Martina McBride, and Travis Tritt song ever recorded, singing at the top of our lungs to stay awake on the road. My media campaign was the essence of simplicity, which would also be my communication strategy as governor. My 2 themes were New Energy for Alaska and Take a Stand. I ran a few upbeat commercials that featured my family and Alaska's natural beauty, highlighting our Piper Super Cub airplane, reading to our kids who attend public schools, and thanking law enforcement officers. It wasn't so much to portray a Little House on the Tundra scene as to let the visual imagery speak to my priorities. In those ads, I promised that I would fight to protect our state's future. I was as sick and tired of the corruption and politics as usual as the majority of Alaskans were, but I kept an optimistic message flowing to show how we'd turn things around for the people. On election night, November 7, 2006, hundreds of us filed into a ballroom at the Hotel Captain Cook to celebrate our victory. We were so thrilled and thankful, and finally tired as the results poured in. We won with nearly half the vote in a 6-way race. Volunteers joined me that morning and in the days leading up to the election, waving signs in the freezing cold with a diesel-generated spotlight that Dad and his buddies jury-rigged to shine on an enormous Palin sign along the highway in the dark winter hours. We were there in the Captain Cook to warm up and celebrate. After our victory speech and between enthusiastic thank yous to our volunteers, we quickly discussed our next morning's press conference and then tried to hit the hay in the hotel before the few remaining nighttime hours turned into our new day. It was a rowdy night, though, because the hallway was filled with our celebrating kids who were eating lots of cake. The morning after my inauguration as governor, I kissed the kids awake, and Todd helped each one of them get ready for their day. I headed to my new office on the 17th floor of the silver-mirrored State Building in Anchorage. Most of the staff, many lawmakers, and by far the greatest number of constituents are in the Anchorage area. Until a road is built to Juneau, an idea that didn't have much support from legislators, less than 10% of Alaskans can conveniently get to their capital. So an obvious part of the new, transparent way of conducting the people's business would be to serve where the people are. That's why I would often work in my Anchorage office, in addition to the one in our much smaller capital city. It was my first day in office, and my core gas line team and I were meeting to kick off our top agenda item. The governor's office has one particularly enviable view, south across the city toward the beautiful mountains of Chugach State Park. From one window, I could see an active volcano, and from another window, Mount McKinley. We overlook Cook Inlet, abundant with sea life, including salmon, halibut, and beluga whales, all safely coexisting with offshore oil rigs for the last 30 years. Almost symbolically, my office also looked directly into the towering gold-mirrored building occupied by the oil giant ConocoPhillips. This melange of views served as a constant reminder of my mission in office to develop our state's resources in the best interests of the environment and of the people, including getting a gas line built. It was a humbling experience to step in to lead an administration that would serve a state of this size and diversity, but I knew we could face a challenge with anticipation and without a sense of overload if we observed Ronald Reagan's principles. Pick your core agenda issues and focus on those. Empower and motivate your departments and staff to implement your vision in other areas. Reagan concentrated on a few key issues and knocked them out of the park. That gave him the political capital to effect change in many other policy areas. I knew if I kept my campaign promise of overhauling the state in the areas of resource development, fiscal restraint, and ethical government, I would also be able to turn attention to equally urgent issues such as education, services for special needs and the elderly, job training, unemployment, and social ills in rural Alaska. We'd be able to do so with reprioritized funding to help the private sector provide opportunities in a way that would help Alaskans stand tall and independent. Ethics reform was also underway, with some lawmakers already under arrest. So to kick off the agenda, we started with the natural gas pipeline on our first day in office. For Alaskans, the term gas line is as familiar as irrigation is to Californians, or Wall Street is to New Yorkers. Except that Californians and New Yorkers already reap the benefits of these economic lifelines, while Alaskans have been waiting more than 50 years to realize the benefits of the state's vast reserves of natural gas. At least 35 trillion cubic feet of proven natural gas reserves lie untapped on the North Slope, and geologists say there are hundreds of trillions more, both on and offshore. Our oil and gas supplies would be enough to provide 10 years of total energy independence for the entire country. Construction of a gas pipeline to transport this safe, clean energy supply to the lower 48 was originally authorized by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in 1979. At that time, a lot of folks had high hopes. Not only would the pipeline become a second economic pillar for the state, creating jobs and development opportunities, but it would reduce our dependence on foreign supplies and therefore our reliance on unfriendly nations. Cheap natural gas from other countries had delayed the project for years. And for years, the big producers who held leases on the gas fields sat on their contracts, preferring instead to develop projects in countries with fewer labor and environmental restrictions. It was unfortunate that our government's well-meaning policies had driven producers to other parts of the world where there were no restraints on their activities. That was no way to protect the environment or heat the economy. With my background, I understood the concerns of all the parties. As a free market capitalist, I understood the bottom line for the oil producers. As a spouse of an oil worker, I understood the slopers and their families' reliance on oil jobs. As a mayor, I understood the community's dependence on oil's economic contributions. As a lover of the land, I understood as well the environmentalists' and Alaska Natives' concerns. Any corporate CEO is tasked with looking out for the bottom line. My business was to look out for Alaskans' bottom line. Our state constitution stipulates that the citizens actually own our natural resources. Oil companies would partner with Alaskans to develop our resources, and the corporations would make decisions based on the best interests of their shareholders, and that was fine. But in fulfillment of my oath, I would make decisions based on the best interests of our shareholders, the people of Alaska. So, in my Anchorage office, amidst the family pictures already on my desk, a grizzly bear skin shot by my dad draped over the couch, my collection of military coins and flags, and Piper's hand-painted artwork taped to the credenza, we established the ground rules for the Gasline team. I won't pretend to have all the answers, I told them, and I won't micromanage you. You guys are the experts. That's why I want you here. I believe then and now that I had the best Gasline team ever assembled anywhere. We were Republicans, Democrats, and Independents all working together, bound by our fierce determination to do things the right way, based on free market competition and a transparent government. Our goal was to commercialize Alaska's treasure of oil and gas by opening up the North Slope Basin to long-term exploration and production, thus creating jobs and ensuring a stable energy supply. We also planned to bring new players to the table. Instead of negotiating over cocktails with the big three oil producers, I intended to craft a bill that would create a framework within which any willing and able company could compete. Most of us spent my first 2 days in office in a windowless conference room, convening with oil executives to listen to their opinions on the pipeline's future. The producers had heavily backed Murkowski in the primary and two-term former Democrat Governor Tony Knowles in the general election. I walked into those meetings with coffee in hand, cookies to serve our guests, and thought to myself, you just spent a year trying to kick my ass, and I just spent a year trying to kick yours, and now we're in this room together. Out loud, I said, "Want a cookie?" Under Murkowski's administration, Gasline negotiations had taken place behind closed doors. Along with 5 others, Marty Rutherford had left her position in the prior administration about a year before I was elected in protest of Murkowski's firing of their team leader, Tom Irwin. The group became known statewide as the Magnificent Seven. Murkowski hadn't appreciated Irwin's efforts to make resource development deals competitive and transparent by opening them to public scrutiny. Evidently, my friend Tom had told Murkowski one too many times that the secret Gasline deal he was negotiating with ExxonMobil, BP, and ConocoPhillips violated the state's constitution. Among other things, his approach relinquished state sovereignty and would unwisely lock in tax rates for decades into the future, despite volatility in the markets. Murkowski didn't like being questioned. Tom loved his state too much to be a part of something that would ultimately hurt it. So he did what I had done when faced with my AOGCC decision. He left so he could be effective elsewhere. Tom went home to Fairbanks, and the rest of the Magnificent Seven also found other jobs. During my campaign, I reached out to Tom and Marty and asked them to come back if I were elected. They were happy to share their expertise. While the other candidates suggested tweaks to Murkowski's plan to hand over state sovereignty to Big Oil, Tom and Marty and I were confident that no amount of tweaking could save it. So I put my name and commitment behind a proposal to open bidding to the private sector. I ran as the candidate who would begin anew with a process that would not and could not be tainted by previous secret negotiations and corrupt legislative votes. During our first week of conferencing with the oil executives, every man, and they were all men, who entered that room knew things had changed. I made a point of saying, we're leaving the door open. Their inches-thick proposals would be displayed out in the reception area for the public and the media to see. Our approach to moving the gas line forward was both innovative and simple. Explain the importance of gas line development to ordinary Alaskans and get them involved. That meant our war room became every kitchen table, town hall, classroom, and living room across the last frontier. We reached out. We asked citizens, these are your resources, so what do you think? Internally, our natural gas mantra was greenies, grannies, and gunnies. Greenies, natural gas is the cleanest non-renewable fuel. Grannies, production of a domestic supply from Alaska would help those on fixed incomes, such as the elderly, by increasing supply and lowering costs in a more stable price environment. Gunnies, Alaska's energy supply would help lead America toward energy independence and greater national security. Greenies, grannies, gunnies. So Alaskan, so politically incorrect. Perfect.